of the screen and select French. I would also like to request you to mute your microphones throughout the session, unless I prompt you to speak. Let me start with some appreciation message in my national capacity and thank members of the Commonwealth here present for your personal and collective contribution to a successful program that was held in June 2022 in Kigali under the theme Delivering a Common Future, Connecting, Innovating, Transforming, during which Rwanda started to assume the position the Commonwealth Chair in office. Thank you very much indeed. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, coming back to our agenda, as you are aware, we are holding this conversation on the sidelines of the Air for Trade, of the Aid for Trade Global Review 2022 that started yesterday and will end tomorrow under the theme of empowering connected sustainable trade. Our session of today, under the theme of calibrating aid for trade to the digital era, is going to be a meaningful contribution to the Aid for Trade Global Review. In relation to matters pertaining to trade integration, sustainable development, and women's economic empowerment, particularly in the context of the economic and trade recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, we will see how digital connectivity can play a significant role in this process. We will discuss ways to foster digital trade, further expand and strengthen trade policies to achieve sustainable development goals in the context of the Aid for Trade initiative. We will discuss ways to address the challenges hindering developing countries from harnessing digital trade benefits and discuss pragmatic solutions to enable developing countries to participate more fully and effectively in digital trade, including through a newly invigorated Aid for Digital Trade agenda and capacity building in digital economy arguments. By doing so, we will contribute to further advance the Aid for Trade agenda. I would like to thank the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Enhanced Integrated Framework, EIF, and the World Economic Forum for organizing this timely session. We live in a digitally transformed world in which the way we used to do things has changed and keeps changing, and we must align all our trade agenda with this reality. Commonwealth family plays a significant role in regional, multilateral, and global trade, and continues to help member states address existing challenges and tap into existing trade opportunities. For example, the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda for Trade and Investment, adopted in 2018, comprises 4 clusters, one of which is digital connectivity. This speaks to digital trade in many ways. The Commonwealth Secretariat has also published a report on the status of digital trade in the Commonwealth with insights on ways to enhance market access through digital trade. EIF continues to assist least developed countries to use trade as an engine for development and poverty reduction and tackle their trade chain. The World Economic Forum mission to ensure that trade benefits people and the planet is well aligned with trade and environmental aspirations of developing countries. This partnership between Commonwealth Secretariat, the IF, the EIF, the World Economic Forum in trade matters is therefore very relevant. I hope our conversation today will go a long way in providing compelling insight on how we can achieve more digital trade gains and calibrate aids for trade initiative to achieve this. I thank you for your kind attention. If you allow, we will now proceed with our interactive discussion with our distinguished panelists. As you will have noticed, we will have 2 rounds of questions, and each of our 4 speakers will have a single question to address in 4 minutes, maximum at each round. For the rest of us, the housekeeping guidelines are as follows. You are requested to type any question you may have for the panelists in the chat box, or if you wish to make a verbal intervention, please select the raise hand icon and wait for me to prompt you to speak during the Q&A session. You may then unmute your microphone and address the audience, and I would ask the participants to keep their verbal interventions brief. Without much ado, let us start with the first round. The first question will go to Mr. Sean Doherty. Mr. Sean Doherty is the head of international trade and investment and a member of the executive committee of the World Economic Forum. He has worked with the forum since 2005, including previously as the director for supply chain and transport. He holds a master's degree in aeronautical engineering from Imperial College, a master's degree in structural molecular biology from the University of London, an MBA from the Collège des Ingénieurs, an executive master's in global leadership from the World Economic Forum, and a master's in international economic law and finance from the University of London. Mr. Sean, our first question to you would be, how is digitalization transforming the landscape of international trade, and what implications does this have for developing countries? Mr. Sean, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me on this session. So I think digitalization has already transformed international trade, and anyone who hasn't adapted is likely out of business or going out of business. And so I think the challenge really is how to continue to innovate and adapt to what are increasingly sophisticated digital business models. So trade processes are one example of what's changing. We talk a lot in the forum about trade tech, but even at the most basic level, sellers in developing markets may not have very elaborate e-commerce shop fronts and the like, but very often they are still finding buyers and arranging sales through Facebook or through WhatsApp, or other tools. And often, platforms are used in ways in which they're not used as much in some of the more developed markets. We also see that the ability to actually make or receive digital payment of some kind can really be critical to closing a deal. Then if we look at governments, they're also increasingly moving trade information and permit application processes online. And so, of course, this cut costs, it speeds things up, and very importantly, it reduces uncertainty and risks. So, for example, the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, which is an organization the forum helps run, has seen lots of interest over the past couple of years in e-FITO declarations as one way to improve trade in agricultural products. Those are seeing quite some success. Now, I was listening to one of the opening sessions of this event yesterday, and Dr. Ngozi said that more than aid for trade, we need investment for trade. And I would agree with that, though I think we also need aid for investment, almost to get us started. Because you see, for trade digitalization to work, we often need a set of services which may not be that easily available in many developing countries. So very few people will have credit cards or debit cards, or even services such as PayPal or equivalents may not be available. And so in order to increase access to some of these digital services, openness to FDI in the digital sphere can help. And to get that may mean adapting regulation to be more welcoming to digital FDI through a digital transactions law or similar. Papua New Guinea, for example, implemented one late last year. Then, of course, there's the whole area of trade in digital products and services themselves, whether we're talking cultural products or education or a wide variety of other digital products and services. And here, developing countries may find that they need to update VAT rules or competition law or various other regulations to ensure that they can welcome the very useful digital imports which they need, while at the same time sustaining government revenue and encouraging domestic business to grow. And then finally, of course, there is the very important digital divide question, which is linked predominantly to digital infrastructure and access charges. So again, yesterday, Mary Pangestu of the World Bank was pointing out that digitalization can be great for inclusion, or it can deepen divides. It depends, how we tackle it. And again, FDI may play an important role. So we've actually just launched a couple of months ago in Davos a digital FDI program, working together with the Digital Cooperation Organization. And our first government partner in that is the government of Nigeria. So I think there's lots of opportunities, but lots to do. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shin, for this very good introduction, especially where you tackled what WTO DG suggested to rather talk about investment for trade. And you are also rightly saying that we may also need aid for investment. And we are very pleased that you highlighted the importance of discussing and handling digital divide, which is a very big challenge that some of our developing countries is still facing to be on board on the digital trade. The second question goes to Ms. Annette Semwemba. Annette Semwemba is the Deputy Executive Director of the Enhanced Integrated Framework, EIF, program and coordinates its overall operations in over 47 developed countries. Prior to that, she was the Chief Strategy and Result Officer and member of the senior leadership team at Trademark East Africa. She is an international development professional for over 20 years of experience in international trade and development, primarily trade policy formulation, regional integration, trade facilitation, and trade-related capacity building at national and regional levels. She holds a master's in business administration from Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. Annette, in an era of expanding digitalization, what lessons can we learn about the role and the importance of aid for trade from country experiences and projects supported by the EIF? Over to you, Ms. Annette.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Ambassador, for your insightful opening remarks earlier, and also the remarks we just had now from Sean. It's really wonderful to join this event today, and I'd like to first express my appreciation to our valued partners, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and also to congratulate you for a CHOGM event that was excellent, and to the World Economic Forum for the engagement towards organizing this session. We are addressing a really important topic, as we've already heard. We all know that the preceding 2.5 years were very challenging globally, but more especially for the LDCs, most notably as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. And despite an initial tendency to look inwards, we eventually witnessed a global shift towards greater connectivity for empowerment and the much needed recovery. But no doubt, I'm sure you all found this trend very interesting and encouraging, but it also almost caught all of us by surprise, and we should have seen it coming. And Ambassador, you said earlier that the change is with us now, and we must adapt. More and more, it has become more clearer globally that economic empowerment can be advanced when we engage with each other and work collaboratively towards a common goal. So undoubtedly, one of the most important tools for greater connectivity towards empowerment is digital. Digital trade has come to the forefront, and aid for trade continues to be an important enabler, especially for the LDCs. And prior to this session, in the practice session, we did have I had a few remarks regarding why this needs to be more and more discussed and more documented to show how aid for trade is more and more important for digitalization. But specific to the question that you asked, Ambassador, first, ownership by the LDCs, both in terms of the recognition of digital trade and the reform process, is critical. And I think we continue to see this ownership grow day by day. We have seen a significant increase in demand from LDCs to invest in digital trade over the last couple of years. And the first step in supporting this process anchors around the diagnostics, the need to really understand what it is here that we need to be addressed. And here we are pleased to be collaborating with UNCTAD on working towards e-trade readiness assessments. So far 9 have been commissioned in LDCs, and at least 7 other LDCs have assessments ongoing through other funding mechanisms. And these e-trade readiness assessments have remained essential roadmaps for the LDCs as they navigate their digital development journeys. Within the COVID-19 context, I'll give an example of a project in the Gambia that we launched in 2021 with the key objective of sustainably increasing through digitalization the income of women horticulture producers and processors who are disproportionately affected by the socioeconomic crisis triggered by COVID-19. And the project established a digital value chain platform that enabled the women to be able to continue some form of trade and ensuring that their perishables had a market irrespective of the movement challenges that existed at the time. Here we had a clearly expressed need by the government of the Gambia towards an important priority. Secondly, creating effective ecosystems for digitalization to thrive is essential. And this is a process that we have already seen is advancing with EIF support towards the development of e-commerce strategies, policies, and legislation in countries such as Bhutan, in Cambodia, Nepal, Rwanda, and Senegal. Aid for trade support can only go so far without the enabling system for interventions to be sustainable. And I think Sean alluded to that in his remarks. And the third important lesson is the role of partnerships. And we seem to talk a lot about partnerships, but within the EIF, these have been very, very critical. In the context of moving from strategy to implementation, very little can be achieved without engagement of partners who bring specific and valued expertise. And for example, with the International Telecoms Union, we've been collaborating to mainstream a gender perspective in domestic policies to ensure women participate fully in the digital economy. And this is in addition to strengthening digital skills for market connectivity in key sectors. We're also proud to have worked with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific to build the capacity of over 1,500 women entrepreneurs in Southeast Asia by providing training on e-commerce and digital marketing skills. And finally, we also need to consider the full circle of the digital process. And here I have an example of Rwanda, which is quite interesting. Rwanda recently commissioned a state-of-the-art e-waste recycling facility following the adoption of an e-waste policy developed through EIF support. And in 1 year, the facility collected 3,000 tons of e-waste and sold and donated nearly 2,000 refurbished computers to schools. And this facility offers a collection service for neighboring countries in Rwanda, the DRC, and Burundi. This has also led to jobs. The interface here is the e-process for this waste facility. These are some solid examples of connectivity, empowerment, and sustainability from an economic and environmental standpoint. If I can, Ambassador, I'll stop here and hand back the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and congratulations for the work that you are doing. And we really learn very much from what you are doing with the respective countries, and at all levels, either at policy formulation level or at very practical implementation level of the e-trade aspects. The third question that I have would go to Mr. Simon Lacey. Simon Lacey is a senior lecturer at the University of Adelaide Institutes for International Trade. Prior to joining the Institute, Simon held the position of Vice President, Trade Facilitation and Market Access at Hawaii Technologies in Shenzhen, China. Before joining Hawaii, Simon worked in over 30 countries, providing training and advice in areas of trade and investment policy to both sovereign and private sector. He holds a bachelor's degree in laws from the University of Fribourg in Switzerland and an LLM from the Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, DC. He's currently completing a PhD at University of New South Wales. Simon, my question to you is, why do we need a newly invigorated aid for digital trade initiative? Over to you, Simon.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the invitation to address you today. I'd like to say I'm very impressed to hear that Sean Doherty studied molecular biology. I've known Sean for many years, and it's something I actually never knew about Sean. As you alluded to, Ambassador, I'm doing a PhD at the University of New South Wales. It's actually on digital trade, and people ask me, what's your PhD about? And I got sick of answering that question. So I just used to tell people that my thesis was a study in the ways that friction ratios affect steering outcomes in aeronautical use under reduced gravity loads, and then let them figure out that I'm really a rocket scientist. But to answer your question, why do we need a newly invigorated aid for trade or aid for digital trade initiative? In a paper that I published last year with the Commonwealth Secretariat, we tried to make a fairly strong case for sort of reimagining and repurposing the Aid for Trade initiative, which I've sort of observed from the very beginning. I was in Hong Kong on a delegation when it was first launched, and I sort of viewed it with much skepticism at the time, but I've really seen how it's evolved into something very valuable. And we made the case in this paper that we published last year as to why we should reinvigorate or relaunch the Aid for Trade initiative as an Aid for Digital Trade initiative. And that really we sort of argued that there were 4 reasons why this should happen. And so the first was sort of the first was really that what we refer to as the economic and other benefits of digital transformation. So I guess what we're trying to say is this sort of refers to the gains from building and operating the underlying networks, but also the sort of value that's created by the connectivity and functionality that these networks provide. So this is for both consumers and businesses. And this really sort of extends deep into efficiency gains and productivity enhancements in industrial processes, thanks to the many technologies that are provided over these networks, like big data analytics, cloud computing, and machine learning. And these are sort of economic gains that countries simply can't afford to miss out on over the long term if they want to develop and improve the lives of their citizens. So that was the first reason. The second reason we gave for reimagining the Aid for Trade agenda as an Aid for Digital Trade agenda was because of the gains to be had from digital trade. And this is something that a number of the speakers, including Sean, have alluded to. And this is what Kati Suominen, who's written quite a lot on this subject, has referred to as the holy grail of world trade, namely seamless integration and automation of the informational, financial, and physical supply chains that undergird trade transactions. So there's a lot more I could say about that, but due to time constraints, I'll move on and let you sort of read the paper. But the third reason why we think it's important to reimagine aid for trade as aid for digital trade is because doing otherwise risks failing to recognize economic reality. And this really goes to the heart of what's happening in the sort of offline and online economies. First of all, they're already massively complementary, but second of all, they're fast converging to simply become the economy. And this leaves governments, businesses, and consumers with no choice but to embrace digital technologies in order to be able to stay relevant and to function in what today is a fast-changing and technologically ever-evolving global economy. And then finally, the fourth reason is sort of a little bit more kind of fear factor, and that is the risk of falling even further behind. So the power asymmetries that the underlying network effects that are inherent to the digital economy seem to sort of reinforce could, if left unaddressed, render firms in developing countries irreparably sort of disadvantaged and unable to dislodge competing developed country firms from entrenched market positions. To simply put, if developing country governments and firms don't want to be relegated to sort of a permanent position of being far behind the curve of value generation and capture, then they need to do everything they can to close the gap in digital capabilities, but also capacities between themselves and advanced industrialized countries. So this is something the OECD has itself recognized in the context of the post-pandemic recovery when it stated in a 2020 paper that failing to ensure widespread and trustworthy digital access and effective use risks deepening inequalities and may hinder countries' efforts to emerge stronger from the pandemic. So those were the sort of four reasons we advanced for why it's time, after more than 15 years of aid for trade, to reimagine this as aid for digital trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insights. We are looking forward to reading the article, and we wish you well for your PhD. Last but not least, the question would go to Ms. Pallavi Bajaj. Ms. Pallavi is an international trade policy advisor focusing on issues of trade policy and the intersection of trade and technology. He specializes in digitally enabled trade and the digital economy, trade in services, economic cooperation, and the integration of SMEs into the global economy. Pallavi is also founder and partner of T-Cube Consulting, a platform for stakeholder engagement, consulting and policy advisor at the intersection of trade, taxes, and technology. He holds an MCs in economics from the London School of Economics and Political Science, a Master of International Law and Economics from the World Trade Institute, and the honors degree in economics from the Lady Freeram College for Women, Delhi University. Pallavi, my question to you is, are digital economy agreements appropriate instruments to address capacity building needs for digital trade? Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I love coming in after everyone because that makes my life much simpler every single time. The simple answer to that question is yes. The longer answer is that it's about economics and numbers, because that's what trade is about. And because the digital economy just works better with larger numbers. You know, the platform model, the gig economy, aggregator models, big data, these are all pillars of digital trade. And they're about exactly this, leveraging technology for scale in trade. You know, technologies that provide access to wider markets, even remote ones, opportunity for more inclusive trade, all of which banks on more jurisdictions per transaction, more numbers for trade via technology, and more data to analyze and feed into demand and supply trends. So really with digital, more is better. And I think that's the crux of the argument. At the same time, DEAs are providing, or digital economy agreements are providing what are much needed frameworks for digital trade, for transparency, for predictability, and more importantly, for security across stakeholders, which is so important as the faceless numbers in the digital economy grow. So on the one hand, these agreements have the potential to streamline digital trade, and that makes them extremely powerful tools for deeper economic cooperation and wider participation. But on the other hand, a lot of developing countries and small enterprises, but I'm going to keep this macro, have capacity constraints which conflict directly with the requirements of these frameworks. And the heterogeneity and complexity of these frameworks threatens to de facto exclude these economies from digital trade by making it too complex to trade, especially for the small businesses in these economies. Now, that's over half the productive capacity and over half the potential markets of the digital economy. And I mean, that is counterintuitive and counterproductive on every level. And it also threatens to make digital trade just less predictable and less secure for all stakeholders across the globe. Because even the best negotiated agreement is only as good as the ability of the least common denominator to comply with it and the incentive of economies to participate in it. So to me, the way to make DEAs really work for the digital economy is to ensure that more economies just have the capacity to participate in them so that more firms and more consumers can be added to the digital economy. And of course, this brings me to my wider point, which is that these two cannot be parallel efforts, widening the geographical coverage of digital agreements and therefore digital trade, and then building capacity for participation in digital trade and DEAs, which is something that everyone has addressed in various ways just before me. Because what that does is it creates what is happening now, a chicken and egg situation. So most current DEAs don't have substantive provisions for capacity building because the membership is largely developed economies or large emerging economies which have existing human or institutional or regulatory capacity for digital trade. And then developing economies and LDCs don't participate because they just don't see the point, or they see it as counterproductive because they don't have the capacity to trade, they don't have the capacity to negotiate these agreements, to benefit from them, or to comply with them. And there are no provisions built into the agreement to assuage these concerns. So really the question is, why have two parallel efforts when you can build capacity cooperation into the agreement and ensure that the implementation of one feeds the other? More countries have less apprehensions joining DEAs, and when they join, they can comply. So that widens the reach of trade. And it can be one of the many benefits of joining a DEA for developing economies. And then from a developed country perspective, again, it widens the reach of trade both on demand and supply, but it also ensures that their partners always have the capacity to comply with standards and requirements. So digital trade just becomes less complex and more secure for everyone. So to me, honestly, the question is not if they're appropriate instruments, but actually why not? And given the pace and nature of technology and trade, I don't see how else it can be done, regulating digital trade without making it less inclusive. So that's my 2 cents, which also we argue with in our Commonwealth THD that we set out a few months ago.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Pallavi. And don't leave the platform, because I think I will start the second round of question with a continuation to my previous question, and which is related to the digital economic agreements as well. You said that there are countries that are not willing to participate, but you also said that it is very important for those countries to be all part of this, what can we do? What needs to be done by us, by the country, by the organization represented on this forum, to bring these countries to participate and benefit from the digital economy agreements? Please, Ms. Pallavi, come back and tell us what.
Thank you once again. It's an extension of what I was saying earlier, actually. Just build substantive provisions on cooperation for capacity building, for participation in digital agreements, and therefore in digital trade into the actual agreements. And the emphasis here is on substantive, not just lip service. So creating a collaborative framework that signals more willingness of the membership to ensure that, one, the digital divide doesn't keep growing wider, and two, the digital economy agreements are not starting to be seen as instruments of de facto exclusion. So really just building in provisions that foster cooperation on the 4 capacity pillars that I was talking about, to trade, to benefit from an agreement, to negotiate the agreement effectively, and then to comply with its provisions and with its requirements. And what that will do is create frameworks that not only cater to various types of capacity, but also simultaneously across stakeholders. Because again, that's the only way it will work, inclusively and with balance. And for example, the wider spectrum of such provisions would include cooperation efforts, both monetary cooperation and technical cooperation or knowledge-based cooperation that will address access issues, for one, both on technology and trade-related digital infrastructure and tools, and then access to markets via that technology, and therefore then building human capacity, digital literacy, digital skills across stakeholders, businesses, policymakers, consumers, and administrators on the use of these tools of trade, and on building and implementing the necessary legal and institutional and regulatory frameworks at home that can then feed into your participation into agreements and into trade, and technical assistance and knowledge sharing on compliance with standards and regulations. We'd also need capacity on negotiating instruments and agreements effectively, the skills, the analytical abilities, workshops, tools, technical assistance for paperless and digitalized trade. I think that's another extremely important thing. And very, very importantly, skills and tools for effective data capturing and analytics, which I think is missing also in a lot of developed countries right now. Just the ability to identify digital trade and effectively capture data on it and analyze it. And of course, most significantly, from an impact of the agreement point of view, benchmarking and monitoring of outcomes and providing flexibility to account for these outcomes as trade and capacity building under the agreement progresses. So it's not a static effort. And I think if we can just cover those in terms of outlining the frameworks and their implementation with timelines and commitments from all parties, both providing the assistance and then taking that and converting it at a domestic level into something substantive, I think that would already be a start. And of course, that would need to be tied into the thread that is my favorite, effective stakeholder engagement, because, you know, wearer and shoe. Collating the voices and inputs of these stakeholders is one part of it, but bringing them on the same page is probably a greater challenge and also very easily addressed by technology. And then with that effective stakeholder engagement, I think the cooperation efforts for capacity building that will emerge will be more structured, impactful. And the DEAs that will come out of that will be more structured and impactful. And collectively, the two of them would really add to the incentive for economies to participate in agreements and therefore at a wider level in digital trade.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You referred to lack of skills and capacity, need for capacity to build the capacities. And I would like to ask my second question to Ms. Annette Semwamba. How can aid for trade better support efforts to build capacity for digital trade in developing countries? Over to you, Annette.
Thank you, Ambassador. And all the
and maybe we'll use like 2 minutes, very quick.
Yes. I'll be very quick. Okay. Thank you. I'll be very quick. And all the points that Pallavi just mentioned, the areas that the EIF is very much focused on, supporting LDCs to build that capacity at policy level, stakeholder engagements. These are all areas that we are engaged in. But of course, the EIF resources are limited, and hence the need to mobilize additional resources. So in my view, inclusivity, making sure that we're targeting the right populations, the women, the youth, and leveraging opportunities to enhance capital and create new skills, create pathways for employment. I think that's one point for me that's really, really important. Infrastructure to support digitalization. This is as well very critical. It's an important issue that arises from the e-trade readiness assessments. Infrastructure is very expensive. And so again, another area where we could see how best to target aid for trade resources, but also enhance the amount of resources that are currently mobilized for this purpose. And the third point is on public-private partnerships. And here we have some really good examples that we have seen in countries like Cambodia, where we brought the private sector and the public sector to invest towards a project that supports a digital project that supports different constituencies. And again, looking at how we can marshal resources from the private sector, complement those resources leveraged from the public sector towards a priority. And this is another message I think that came through yesterday when we, at the opening plenary with Dr. Ngozi, she did mention investments for trade, and we've had this already. But again, she mentioned the importance of mobilizing resources from both the public and the private sector. So those are 3 points that I would like to raise here. Inclusivity, making sure that we can harness resources from the public and the private sector, and also investments in infrastructure for digital trade. Ambassador, I hand back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for using efficiently the time I allocated to you. And the following question will go to Mr. Shin Doherty and underlines the importance of partnerships. How can we harness development partnerships involving the private sector and aid for trade to foster the digital economy, unlock digital trade, and overcome digital divides? Over to you, Mr. Shan.
Thank you. Well, I think as Anita just suggested, it's generally a good idea to involve the private sector in aid for trade work, given that trade is something which is generally actually done by the private sector. And I think this is particularly important on digital issues, given governments can take a little longer to catch up with somewhat fast-changing technology and business models. And I would emphasize that involving the private sector shouldn't mean inviting a couple of business associations to one workshop. You really need in-depth discussions with multiple businesses. Some of those will need to be confidential, and they need to kind of continue throughout the process so that the private sector really feels some ownership of the reform which is being done. Obviously, this tends to work best for B2G and G2B type projects. Business ones usually best left to businesses themselves, and it's somewhat hard to motivate businesses to get too involved in government projects unless they're actually acting as commercial service providers. But generally we're talking about market entry frictions, operational frictions. So these are really typical trade and investment facilitation type work. And we're seeing that obviously these are happening. A good proportion of the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, which I mentioned before, the 30 or so project that it runs, many of those involve digitalization of customs or other border agencies. And as digitalization and data management and data governance, they can be fairly technical. I think there is also a lot of scope for training and experience exchange. We've been running a series of digital trade governance workshops across Southeast Asia recently, because it's hard for either business or for government to fully understand the implications of any particular policy or administrative approach by themselves. And so it can be useful to sit down and jointly work through, let's say, the cybersecurity consequences of a new data management process. And so I've been scribbling notes here on everything Pallavi was saying earlier about how to improve capacity building provisions in DAs, because I think that's an important way forward. And then finally, as government and business can have quite different cultures, it really is important to have this strong community management to really keep everyone working together as you deliver reforms. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your answer, Mr. Shen. And indeed, digital partnerships are very important. But you were talking about partnership between public and the private sector, and the importance of training. And I also thought about involving the higher learning institutions, because they are mainly the one doing research, and maybe because we are going to the last question to someone who is doing a PhD, he will be able to handle this. But my main question to Mr. Simon would be, in which policy areas would the implementation of an aid for digital trade agenda have the greatest impact? Over to you, Mr. Simon.
Yep, sorry, thanks for that. Let me unmute very quickly. Yeah, I mean, in the paper I published last year with the Commonwealth Secretariat, we outlined a number of ways to, as we describe it, give the aid for digital trade agenda legs, by which we essentially mean sort of mainstreaming online connectivity and digital adoption into the aid for trade agenda. So the first and most obvious of these is in the infrastructure space, which other panelists have also alluded to. And that just means connecting sort of the rest of humanity to the internet through one or more forms of broadband access. But, you know, one of the case studies in our report shows, namely the one on connecting the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea with an undersea fiber optic cable, shows that simply building infrastructure isn't enough. So you need to also have policies in place that effectively result in affordable access to this infrastructure to as many people as possible. Otherwise, the gains that this infrastructure creates are captured by really the sort of the wrong actors. So that's the first, infrastructure. Then there's the need to focus on enhancing digital skills and adoption, sort of all age groups in the economy, and that drives digital inclusiveness. Next, and very importantly, we discuss e-government to improve the business and regulatory environments. And if that's done thoughtfully, that can really unleash the entrepreneurial zeal and productive capacity of you know, or underemployed workers in developing countries. And then finally, we highlight the many benefits that digital tools can provide to enhancing financial inclusion and sort of lowering the barriers to formalization, which is a big priority for many governments as they try to bring more of the informal sector into the formal sector. So all of these areas are important, they're complementary, they're mutually reinforcing building blocks in closing the gap between developing and developed countries. And they're essential to achieve the goals at the heart of the Aid for Trade agenda, namely helping entrepreneurs and businesses in developing countries to better connect with the global trading system. That was really the underlying motivation for launching this agenda back in Hong Kong in 2005. So thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. And this brings us to the last part of our session, which is a Q&A session that we have like 7 minutes. We remain with 7 minutes. We've had the opportunity to listen to our distinguished speakers. I hope we've learned a lot from their expert views. And now I would like to open the floor to participants. As previously announced, you may use the chat box. I don't have questions yet in the chat box, but you participant can also make a verbal intervention. Since time is not on our side, I kindly request to make your verbal intervention brief. 1 to 2 minutes will be sufficient. You may also wish to mention the speaker to whom your question is addressed. Our panelists will take note and will give some few minutes to respond before we close this session. The floor is now open.
Ambassador, I think we have Julia with the hand up.
Julia, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you very much for giving me the floor. I would like to refer to a session that took place yesterday by the LDC group, so by the group of the least developed countries. They were referring to a report by ITU that said that although more than 70% of the people in least developed countries are covered by a broadband signal, only 25% were actually using it. So you were referring quite often to the importance of infrastructure, but also that that is not enough. So my question is, if really the lack of awareness is the main issue, according at least to the ITU study, for LDCs not using the internet, not using the digital economy, what would be, in your experience or the research that you've been doing, the main advice to change the situation for least developed countries?
Thank you, Julia. Would Simon like to respond?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, this is something that we saw when we did our case study on the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, and so the problem was that all of a sudden this cable was connected to Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and that allowed for, in theory, much better, much cheaper access. But there wasn't a competition policy or a telecommunications policy framework in place that would force the mobile telecom operator to pass on those savings to users, to consumers or businesses. And it was just too easy for the operator to make the argument that, oh well, we've already got locked-in contracts with our customers, and we don't really need to change the terms of those contracts until they expire, in 18 months or 12 months from now. And so really, unless you have a very sort of proactive government that's willing to step in and infringe sort of private contractual rights in this case and force mobile operators to pass on those savings, then that's not going to happen. So really you need policy frameworks in place that provide for affordable access to as many users as possible, and that's what has been the backbone of projects like the National Broadband Project in Australia, but in other initiatives that have really seen that, because these are oligopolistic markets, you need to force players to compete fairly and share the benefits fairly and equitably.
Thank you very much. And we have two questions in the chat box, one for Mr. Doherty and another one for Ms. Bajaj. The first one, I will go through both of them, and you will respond after. The first one, I would like to ask Mr. Doherty to elaborate more about the digital FDI initiative. As I understood, it is piloted in Nigeria. How will be other countries selected? The question to Ms. Bajaj, many of the states least well served by digital trade are small states. Because of their small markets, they are not attractive to investment. What business model is best suited to address this situation? We may start by Mr. Shin for the responses to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I mentioned this digital FDI initiative we're running together with the Digital Cooperation Organization. And the way in which we kind of build partnerships with countries, it's very simple. There needs to be clearly an interest from the government itself. There also importantly needs to be interest from private sector, both international and domestic, to indicate that there is a sort of pool of investment which wants to enter that country, but is facing some difficulties. Of course, there needs to be agreement from donors as well. But based on those criteria, then we move forward. So as I say, just started with Nigeria, looking at a couple of other countries currently, potentially Pakistan, others. So hopefully expanding soon.
Thank you. Ms. Bajaj, can you respond to the second question?
It's a very interesting question, and to be honest, I'm going to answer it, but I also want to know what Sean has to say about it. I think he might have a thing or two to say. I'm going to say small markets are still markets, and there are two ways to attract investment into these markets. One is to first create an effective consumer base. I think a lot of the times it is about digital literacy, digital skills. What we were talking about earlier is that not enough consumers are using technology at all. So one, educating consumers and creating frameworks that build confidence among them to even accept digitally provided trade as an effective model of, say, taking services. And then also helping businesses in these economies build capacity to be able to deliver digitally, because that's another attractive market for intermediate services to feed into the businesses when they start to trade digitally as well. So there are ways to build that market, but I think it really starts with digital literacy, digital skills, teaching both businesses and consumers that, one, how to use these tools, how to use digital technologies in trade, but also that giving them the confidence that they have accountability frameworks in place and, consumer and data security frameworks in place that give them the confidence to actually use these technologies. And I think that will help build a market, and from there we grow to attract more investment.
Thank you very much. There is a third question addressed to you, Ms. Bajaj, but maybe you will respond to the chat to the person that is, because we are running out of time. And Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to an end of the very short, I recognize, Q&A answer session. Many thanks to our speakers and to all of you who actively participated in this session. I hope we'll have more sessions like this to talk about trade matters that are so close to our shared goals. I will now invite Mr. Brendan Vickers, Head of International Trade Policy at the Commonwealth Secretariat for closing remarks. Over to you, Mr. Brendan.
Thank you, Ambassador, and we'd certainly take up that invitation to do further work on this issue. I think there are many aspects that we weren't able to cover, but I think this has been a really enriching conversation. I'd just like to first thank our partners, the Enhanced Integrated Framework for LDCs and the World Economic Forum, for jointly organizing today's session, and to our panelists for their valuable insights and practical recommendations. And a really big thank you to you, Ambassador, for moderating our sessions. I had a couple of takeaways, but we don't have much time, so perhaps just I'll raise two. I think first is really the need to bridge the digital divide between and within countries, because without this online connectivity, and we talk about all these large, big trade concepts and trade tech, but basically when people aren't online, they are denied many of the educational, the health, the business and the social opportunities needed to thrive and even to achieve the sustainable development goals. And second, I think this issue of investment in digital infrastructure, particularly supporting digital connectivity, is really important, as well as investment in the key sectors that really underpin the digital economy. And this is so important for building more resilient economies and societies post-COVID-19. So going forward, I think what we've heard is there's an urgent need to rethink and reimagine, to quote Simon Lacey, how multilateral, regional and bilateral aid for trade initiatives can be repurposed to address the impediments to the uptake of digital technologies and digitalization in developing countries, especially to provide a level playing field. So this is not the end of the conversation, it's just the start, and we look forward to continuing with everyone in the days ahead. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the moderation, if you're still there. And have a lovely rest of your day.
Have a nice day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks to the interpreters.